He sexualizes women, which is not Christian masculinity.
Right.
It is masculine.
Right.
It is masculine, but it's masculinity debased by sin. It is contorted and corrupted masculinity. But it is, when I say it's still masculine, maybe you've heard this expression, maybe you haven't. Some people don't like it. Which
means it's a good one.
Which means it's good, yeah. Have you ever heard somebody say, he's sinning, but he's sinning in the right direction? Have you ever heard that adage?
Okay, this whole conversation about masculinity and Andrew Tate has completely lost the plot at this point, and I can't not talk about it, because if we're going to stand up to secular ideologies entering into the church, and in particular things that come from a Marxist atheist worldview, talking about wokeness, social justice, the ideologies that make up those things, if we're going to defeat those trying to enter the church, then we do need an accurate view of masculinity. But that has been lost in this conversation. So let's dive into the episode. Welcome to the we're actually changing things a little bit. Welcome to the first episode of the TLDR Christianity podcast, no longer the Enemies Within the Church podcast. Yes, we are still associated with Enemies Within the Church, but this now is much more of my podcast as opposed to Enemies Within the Church podcast, as well as I'm changing up slightly the format. Going to be a little bit more of an emphasis on the teaching aspect, and diminishing slightly just the presenting of error. I need to be giving more pushback than I've given. I need to be bringing in more scripture than I have. Last season in particular was a little bit of a experiment, since it was just me, since Sam couldn't join. And now it's going to be just me going forward. I need to find a format that works, that doesn't cause burnout, because there's so much burnout in the world of responding to error and also giving positive teaching. There's a lot of burnout there, and I want to make sure that I'm doing what needs to be done, doing what is helpful, and not just slipping into a cynical mindset. Now, with that, yes, we have a new name, the TLDR Christianity podcast, making big ideas easy to pick up. That's the goal of this podcast. I want to be able to take these things, break them down in a way that you can understand them. We'll talk a tiny bit more about the podcast at the end, but I do want to remind you that you can still go watch the documentary Enemies Within the Church at EWTCnews.com. Again, EWTCnews.com. You can go watch the documentary and view the other resources that are there. And if you want to support the podcast, you can go to the Patreon or the Give, Send, Go, which I'd prefer that. Patreon gives more interaction, but Give, Send, Go is better organization. You can go to those. Those are linked in the description. But what are we going to be talking about this week? It is masculinity. Masculinity. And we're going to respond to, and we say this in the interview, and we say we because I'm going to be interviewing Dirk Walstead, man who has proven himself to be masculine, a man of integrity. And we say this in there, but I want to clarify, this isn't about bashing some of the people that we mention. But I needed to point out on the conservative side of things that a lot of the conversation is unhelpful. And I want to reach those people that are trying to get some answers and are feeling left unhelped by some of the things that have been said. I want to get things back on track. That is the hope and goal of this episode. So I really hope you enjoy my conversation with Dirk. Whoa, hold on a second, Kyle. You forgot to mention something. We're going to be doing Q&As, live streams for the podcast going forward to help answer any questions that weren't addressed in an episode correctly or fully, whatever it is, pushback that people have, want to respond to things. So if you do have questions about this episode, go ahead, leave me those questions. and I'll try and, I'll take them, use them for that Q&A, that live stream. If there's a bunch that are all the same, form into one question, answer that. Whatever it is, I want to be addressing the thoughts that people have. So go ahead and leave me your thoughts. Now let's get into the episode. So, like I said, we're talking about masculinity, and I didn't want to do this just by myself. I wanted to bring someone on to help play off this topic a little bit. And I'm going to let Dirk here, I'm going to let him say a little bit about who he is. But I wanted to clarify why I reached out to Dirk. Now, part of that is because I know Dirk. We live not too far from each other. First heard about him via Conversations That Matter, and his story about his church and COVID and some of the social justice things and confronting these ideas and confronting some of these things, and just appreciating the stand he took. And then I started to recognize a few things, and I was like, wait a second. I think he lives like right next to me. But I've seen his character, but also I've seen his character when it comes to masculinity. He is a man that has proven himself to have integrity and proven himself to carry himself in a way that is very masculine, whatever definition you're going to put on that. So, Dirk, why don't you go ahead and let us know a little bit about yourself and correct anything that I might have said?
Yeah, thanks. It's good to be on. Yeah, so I'm Dirk. I'm married. I've got 7 kids, and a small. We have a small farm, and I'm actually a 3rd generation carpenter. So work with my hands.
What did I say? What did I say?
And I don't know. I don't know what you said, but yeah. So life is very busy on my end. We're part of a little local church, and actually a historic church here in our town, which is really cool. I really like just thinking that the faith is still being carried on after 100 years in the same building and in the same place. And one of my boys actually gets to ring the bell before service every Sunday. So he takes his job very seriously, and I love it. So,
well, it's even more exciting because the area you're in is one of the most hostile areas in the country when it comes to Christianity. So, being in a historic church there, that's just such a blessing. That community needs, we both know that community needs that light so desperately. So that's such a wonderful little thing to hear.
Yeah. It was funny. The first time I got an opportunity to fill in for my pastor and teach there, it was in adult Sunday school. And I stood there, and suddenly what went through my mind was how many faithful men had stood in this same spot at this same lectern in the past. And it kind of almost kind of just overwhelmed me. Yeah. Just because it's just like you start realizing that, every Christian does this, but I think a lot of times, you forget you're carrying on something that's been carried on by a lot of people before you. And the whole goal is just to do a good job and hand it on to the next generation. And so, especially for myself, I love being a dad, and I've got 4 boys. So I think a lot about that too, about what am I teaching them and what am I handing off to them as, future Christian men. So.
Yeah. So like I said, if you can't tell, Dirk definitely meets the a lot of assumptions when it comes to masculinity, especially a lot of the conversations that are being had right now around things that are missing. So I thought that it would be a good partner to bring on here to kind of bounce some of these thoughts off. But why are we talking about this right now? Why are we talking about masculinity right now? It's because there's been, over the years, there's been a lot of controversy within the church, coming from the secular world, whatever angle it is, there's been controversy over masculinity. It's hated, just as much as femininity is. Specifically talking about biblical. What does the Bible say about man? What does the Bible say about woman? These things are despised by the world. Now, why are they despised by the world? Because the world despises the God that told us what these things are. But there's been a flare-up that caught me so off guard, that offended me so much. In fact, I'm used to looking at the different woke nonsense, those different controversies. And I haven't become immune to being shocked by the things I see there. But I was not immune to this. I was more shocked by this than some of the woke nonsense, some of the social justice type of things. And in particular, there's been a controversy around Christian men looking towards a man named Andrew Tate. Now, if you know nothing about who he is, let's just cover a few things briefly. He made his millions off of pornography, forcing women to perform on webcams. He is a Muslim and attaches that to masculinity. He is a admitted manipulator of women, abuser of women. Again, you can't get around this. There are videos of him both admitting this and doing this. So much more. When it comes to disgusting individuals, it's hard to top the sorts of things he does. Now, why would anyone look at that? Well, they would look at it because he appeals to something, and he appeals to our sin nature. He appeals to the carnality of men, especially men that are feeling disenfranchised in a modern society that's been going in a radically different direction than where they are feeling. In an hyper-urban society that's going in a Marxist direction, men are feeling disconnected from pretty much everything. And they're looking for something that can answer the questions that they have. And Tate says, here, I'll give you an answer. I'm going to charge you for it. He's run a lot of different scams. He's going to charge you for it. But he's also going to try and steal you at the same time. He wants you to get addicted to pornography because it makes him money. He wants you to be dependent on him because it makes him money. I don't know why you'd follow a man like this. Now, you might ask yourself, if you don't know what's going on, you might go, well, why? What does this have to do with Christianity? Because people started speculating. And this is where the speculation really kind of hits the road. We're going to look at a little clip here. And for the moment, we're only going to look at the introduction just to see, yes, this is something that's being addressed. And I want to make it clear, this is not about, we're going to have to talk about names. This is not to bash individuals as a whole, but this is to talk about certain presentation of ideas and how dangerous that presentation is. We don't have to defend everything. There are certain times you can look at something and just say, that's worthless. I'm going to move on. I'm going to condemn it and move on. That's it. But let's look at this a little bit.
And let's just say it. I feel like it goes without saying, but obviously it doesn't. What do we not like about Andrew Tate? He's Muslim.
Yep.
He worships a demon god named Allah. He's a foreigner. He doesn't live in England. He's traveling the world, saying that he's for nationalism, but going into countries that are not his own.
He's perverse and profane as the day is long, without any filter whatsoever.
Crude, perverse, lewd. He sexualizes women, which is not Christian masculinity.
Right.
It is masculine. It is.
I got to validate myself here a little bit. Would you call that a fair rundown of the issues with Tate? Or kind of a softening?
I mean, in one sense, it's fair. I mean, if you actually, I looked him up because I was like, well, in some sense, not everybody, a lot of people know who he is, but I wanted to make sure I understood. He's actually under investigation. I think 5 different indictments, different cases in UK and Romania for sex trafficking, rape, including statutory rape, multiple accusations and cases of statutory rape and organized crime.
He's bragged about doing that, by the way.
Yeah, actually, I really don't understand, because he's bragged about some of his scams, that he's scammed people as well. So yeah. I really don't understand why the guy's not in jail now. Although I do know that there's also fairly credible accusations of him and his brother threatening violence to people, and suddenly some of these people have not been so vocal to testify. So there's, and again, organized crime accusations, I think in Romania, are like actual indictments and whatnot.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexity.
Yeah, in some sense, they give an okay rundown. He's vile, he's this, is that. I think it's also funny that he doesn't live in his home country, as though that's just lumped right in there with some of these other things, as though that's a sin. I don't quite understand that one. So it's kind of in one sense, yeah, they're saying it, although I think like you could be even more graphic in being how clear, like, this is as bad of a social media influencer as there probably is in the Western world, I think.
Yes.
I think we could say that. He glorifies every possible perversity when it comes to men abusing women at this point.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Well, and that's what bothers me a little bit is, I mean, if nothing else, why isn't the pornography coming up? Why isn't that? That would be, I mean, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is he's a creator of pornography and he pushes that heavily. Why is that not come up? And then that's attached to part of his abuse of women. Why are those seem to be the largest things, not the smallest, not something to not mention.
And to make a point with that, I think actually what you're saying is really good, because you say, well, they said he's vile, but there's a difference between vileness of a person, it's a horrible things, and someone who actually not only is doing that, but is promoting it, capturing other people in it, making money, getting women. Again, he's actually under indictment for human trafficking. So these things go beyond, the sort of low life person who's just engaging in these things. He's actually entrapping lots and lots of other people into his net and using them and making money off of them. So just to be fair, like, vile is an accurate word, but he's like, I think, reading what I read today was they think he makes about $5 million annually off of these things. So this is someone who's getting rich off of pornography and vileness.
He's getting rich off of manipulating weak men into believing that if they follow him, they'll become masculine men.
Yeah.
That's such a fundamental, I mean, his entire masculine persona is about a lie. But anyway, let's continue on with this. Let's continue on.
It is masculine.
Right.
It is masculine, but it's masculinity debased by sin. It is contorted and corrupted masculinity. But it is, when I say it's still masculine, maybe you've heard this expression, maybe you haven't.
Okay, we're going to get to the big controversy point, but I cannot. Again, I don't want this to be a bash session, but as a father of a daughter, and I know you are as well, I got to be honest. I want to go Saint Nick on Leben for saying that it is masculine to sexualize women, and then covering it up with, oh well, it's masculinity corrupted. No, don't say that about my daughter. Seriously, I cannot believe that statement.
Well, once you say it's corrupted, at some point it becomes a worthless statement then, and I'm sure we'll get into that later. What do we mean when we say masculinity? But he's a man and he's doing something. Is that all that, that's all that masculine means in this context, which is a pretty worthless statement.
Well, that's what kind of concerns me about all this, is there's a lot of stuff that's just not clear. But let's get to the main controversy point.
Which means it's a good one.
Which means it's good, yeah. Have you ever heard somebody say, he's sinning but he's sinning in the right direction. Have you ever heard that adage? It's like, well, no sin can be in the right direction. To sin is to miss the mark. It's to point, the bow in the wrong direction. It's to go the opposite of the direction of God. And so, like, all sin is in the wrong. Yes, no, duh. Of course, all sin is going away from God. It's rebelling against God, and so therefore, in the macro sense, of course, in a theological ultimate sense, all sin is in the wrong direction. Here's what the expression means: to sin in the right direction. A guy who is a womanizer is sinning. Okay, again, I said we're going to state our bona fides, so let me say that again, so it's blatantly clear. Sinning, it's sin. Andrew Tate has made a career for himself that has been marked in many ways by overt, plain, obvious sin. However, Trans Library Story Hour is not only sin, but it's sinning in the wrong direction. It's when I'm speaking of direction, I'm speaking of nature. There's
conformity to reality.
Okay, I think that's sufficient for the moment to introduce the controversy and kind of get a feeling of why does this need to be talked about? Because my biggest issue is how unhelpful those kind of comments are. They don't help. You have a young man and he's struggling with many different things. He's probably addicted to pornography if he's following Tate. And statistics say that even within the church, that yes, that's a massive problem. And he's looking towards Tate. Here's the question. Functionally, how does what Webben said help that young man? Can it help that young man?
Yeah, I mean, he wants to contrast it to essentially LGBT issues and say, well, look, nothing's as bad as LGBT issues. So as long as you're not doing that, then somehow it's in the positive direction. But I mean, one of the things is we don't look at somebody who looks at women essentially as disposable and says, well, at least it's a man looking at women that way as opposed to like a same-sex relationship or something. At that point, to say that's a positive, you're really struggling to find a positive there.
Let me quickly quote this from that Tate released just a couple weeks ago. It's a tweet. Fact, women are sex workers. Their primary job now is to find one customer, call the boyfriend, and to pay for their entire lives in return for sex. If they fail at this, they do OnlyFans or porn. The same game with more than one customer. If they're ugly, they work a job badly and are miserable. So just to validate what you were saying.
Yeah. Beyond that, I think the particular clip you showed, or a section of it, was going around Twitter. I guess we're supposed to say X now, but
Twitter.
Well, it's confusing. I say X. I use X as the the problem to be solved. So anyway, it was going around. It went fairly viral the other day, and what was interesting is it only took a few hours for somebody to dig up a video of Tate, which I don't have a link to it. I'm sure it can be found, but a video of Tate saying that he would rather have sex with a really hot transgender, meaning a man pretending to be a woman, than a really ugly woman. So, I mean, again, when you think, well, at least he's leading boys towards wanting to, lusting after women instead of other men. Like, again, that's such a tenuous thing. And when you say, but at least he's promoting masculinity, like, I don't know what kind of masculinity that is, because, that's the sort of thing that again, like, they already said it, it's vile. So what actually good is being promoted here?
Yeah. Well, funny you should mention that clip. I have that clip. And I went back and forth, but I ultimately decided I'm not going to play the clip. It's so perverse. I'm not going to play that on the podcast. But I have that clip.
Yeah.
And worse than what you said, he says that, because anyway, there's a whole bunch of things, but he says that it would be gay to have sex with the woman, the biological woman, and that the straight thing to do, the implication is then the straight thing to do is to have sex with the man.
So again, even it's interesting. I mean, he's a product of our culture that has, I don't know how many genders or whatever.
It's flesh is flesh.
He's British, so it really doesn't matter. It's whatever makes me happy, and so he thinks that this makes him happy. Somebody else thinks the other makes him happy. I think people misunderstand. There are sins that are more egregious than others. It is more egregious to act out in adultery or fornication than it is to have it in your heart. It's a horrible thing to have it in your heart. It's more egregious to murder your neighbor than to have murder in your heart. It's still a horrible sin before God and before your neighbor to have it in your heart. But so we understand. We don't just want to level out. Some people make the mistake of saying every sin is exactly equal. Well, that's not actually true. There are sins that need to put you in jail, and there are sins that do not, right? There are sins that every pastor, every church leader sins because we all sin, but there are sins that are disqualifying, and there's a big difference. But and Paul says in Romans 1 that talking about the natural use of the woman. In other words, even nature would say don't go down what we'd say today, the LGBT route. But that doesn't say, oh, well, so at least they're not doing that, so that's a positive. I mean, you're looking at your culture with such a cynical lens if you're thinking that I can look at this person who basically sells sex in every possible way, his Instagram, what he says, what he promotes to young men. He literally sells pornography.
Do not look up his social media. Do not look it up. I'm just making that super clear right now. Do not.
That's how cynical you are of your society when you say, well, at least this guy isn't this other stuff over here. Like that just tells you're pretty cynical about society at the moment then.
Yeah. Well, you've made one enemy the ultimate enemy, and then everything else, even if it's bad, is so much inferior. But the problem is, again, Tate's promoting the same thing. He's promoting homosexuality and weird perversions mixed in there. But even ignoring that, the Bible doesn't say, when the Bible handles the categories, like murderer, like adulterer, sexually immoral, homosexual, it puts all these categories next to each other and says all of these are people who are what? Not inheriting the kingdom. In fact, let's jump over, because what is appealing about Tate? Who's going to follow someone if they're portraying biblical masculinity? They're not going to follow him if he's promoting true biblical masculinity. What he sells, he's clear about what he sells. It's sex, it's pornography. But what he sells them is this. Galatians 5:19-21. Now the deeds of the flesh are evidence, which are immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmities, strife, jealousy, outbursts of anger, disputes, dissensions, factions, envying, drunkenness, carousing, and things like these, of which I forewarn you, just as I have forewarned you, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. Dirk, tell me which thing on that list does Tate not engage in? Does not promote?
That's exactly right. Like I was thinking about, there's I think it's in Colossians. There's Paul makes a statement that slaves to various passions, and you have something fairly similar in his letter to Titus. You have this thing who's absolutely enslaved to sin, all of those things, right? And you look at that and you go, it's exactly 180 degrees opposite of what, I have a 16-year-old son. I understand and have made very many steps to keep the temptation and the possibility of pornography away, because I understand and have read the statistics on this. This is a huge problem, and it's a huge problem, you said this earlier, in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And to say, well, but at least, hey, the public school wants to turn him gay or something. So at least he's only addicted to female pornography. At that point, you're really looking at it and you're going, but he's absolutely a slave to his passions, a slave to lust. And again, you can read the studies. I don't think we want to get into it tonight, but you can read the studies about literally what pornography does to brain chemistry, how it destroys marriages, it destroys future marriages.
Mm-hmm.
It's just so incredibly destructive.
I can add a tiny bit to that, because before I was saved, I got into that. I got into pornography, and it warps you. It really, really warps you. It destroys that which should. It destroys your sexuality. It twists it, perverts it. I am just as broken, naturally speaking, as someone who practices homosexuality. My desires are out of order, and it's only by the grace of God that could be reordered. Only by the grace of God. But it really does mess you up permanently in the flesh. Now, I can look at I could justify that, and I did when I was younger. I did. And talking about friends in the church, they did as well. And I'm just thankful that God saved me out of that. Because I look at those people and where they're at now on their, I have friends from church that are on their third marriage and wondering why it keeps failing. And it's just, it warps you. It puts you in a category of perversion that is equal to any other sexual perversion. Now, you can tack on, like with homosexuality, you tack on additional layers to that. Because not only is it this sexual perversion, but now you're involving a new perversion as well. But you're adding on a new layer to that. But it's just as perverse. It's outside of God's design.
Yeah, and I think that's why, Romans 1 can make the distinction about the pit that non-believers they suppress the knowledge of God and all this, and you can go that. But then, so Paul makes that point. It's against nature itself, and I know that's the point that clip was trying to make, but making it so badly as to actually literally say the opposite. It feels like, but at the same time, there's a bunch of other places where the Apostle Paul can simply say, and the other New Testament writers as well, can just simply say sexual immorality. And so in other words, there's one text we have that makes it very clear that the ultimate, if you will, as you ultimately go in your rebellion against God, you become so unnatural that even the sex acts become absurd. And we look at where our culture is now and all of the genders and all of this and that, and they keep adding letters to the alphabet soup of what you are and everything. And that we're seeing Romans 1 in real time. But the interesting thing is most biblical texts, most New Testament texts, when he applies it, he doesn't actually have to say any of that. He just says sexual perversity or sexual immorality and covers all of the categories. Because all of the categories, in one sense, you can divide them out. And in another category, we don't need to divide them out. We can just say that's sexual immorality. Like, you wouldn't look at a guy who says, well, yeah, I cheated on my wife, but that could be worse.
Yeah, at least I didn't do it with a man.
Yeah, exactly. And so
that doesn't help in that situation. The primary effect of the sin has not changed. You destroyed your marriage. That doesn't change who you did it with. You still destroyed your marriage equally.
Yeah, and I think the issue too is when you have somebody who's a Christian minister or is somebody that people are looking up to, I think it's distressing when they're like, well, yeah, it's sinful, but again, sometimes people talk, it's appropriate sometimes to talk in the church about small sins. Sometimes we look the other way with gossips. That's a huge sin that can destroy Christian fellowships.
Mm-hmm.
It's amazing how strong the Bible speaks about gossips or coveting, things like this. These are actually very destructive, very corrosive sins. But you can talk about those as small sins. But I think the problem is that in the clip, he'd say, well, yeah, we said it was bad, but also, and it almost sounds like you're calling it a small sin. Now, I'm sure there's been some clarification and stuff, so we can say, well, I didn't really say it was a small sin. But that's, in many ways, I think what we're responding to is saying, I don't want to just let that sit there. That needs to be said as strongly as possible. This is a sin that is destroying men right now, destroying women right now. And there's actually a very high percentage of women that are addicted to porn as well. And there are many young men and young women in the church and outside of the church that are going to be infected with this. And so it's very, very, very dangerous.
And there's a whole rabbit trail of conversations that need to be had, that are being had in the church nowadays, but I think a lot of times not in a useful way. And that's one of the things we need to bring back. Sometimes conversations are great, but does it have any practical value? Or are we just doing, an intellectual exercise? But, conversations about how do we deal with the epidemic of pornography and so many other perversions that go along with that in the church, that's a big thing. It does need to happen. But let's kind of keep it, let's keep it back on what we're talking about for now. Someday we'll cover more things, but
it is a big subject. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I want to bring out is, for those who are listening audio, we're looking at a couple images here. I'll read things out just so you get that as well. But this image in particular was my introduction to this controversy. This was the first thing I saw on the controversy. And now it's a picture of Matt Chandler with his family in a silly pink Christmas sweater. And the caption is, the reason young Christian men are listening to Tate is because evangelical leaders look like this. Now, I immediately look at that and I went, that's a complete category error. People aren't going after looking to Andrew Tate because Matt Chandler or any other pastor wore a pink sweater. Now, is Matt Chandler a good influence in any sort of way? No, he's one of the most destructive influences in the American church. But it's not him wearing a pink sweater or even the sermons that he's giving that are causing Christian men to listen to Andrew Tate. The Christian men are listening to Andrew Tate. Why? Because he's giving them something that they, in their flesh, desire, and no one is pulling them back from that. No one is saying, hey, that's sinful. Hey, I'm going to pull you back from this man because he's dangerous. But, let's just, again, to emphasize the point, another person, and again, this is Dale Partridge, not to bash on him, but unhelpful things being said. They're not pushing men towards masculinity. He said, at first blush, yes, but when you examine further, you grasp that young men see vital features of Christ in Tate, particularly bravery, boldness, strength, etc. Now, we'll read a couple more, but I just want to ask you this. I want to ask you this, Dirk. Is boldness a specifically masculine trait?
Well, I think what you'd want to say, and again, we're talking from a Christian perspective when we're defining masculinity. I'm not going to go to Wikipedia to define it as a Christian, as a Christian in my church, for my family, whatever. So boldness, you'd want to say it can be. You have many examples in the Bible of people who were bold. You also, interestingly enough, have many examples of very wicked people that were bold as well. So what's interesting about this particular tweet is he's saying boldness. You have wicked rulers who are very bold, who are very anti-Christ. You can think about the kings of Babylon and whatnot, who are incredibly bold. And that's a negative thing. And that's not a positive masculine trait. You can think of of taking all of the implements in the book of Daniel. You have the king that takes all the implements from the temple, and he drinks to them and toasts to his own gods, and basically says, "Oh, God of Israel, what are you going to do about this?" It's an incredibly bold move, and obviously, the story. It doesn't pay off for him. But in that same book, you have another example of somebody who seems less bold at first blush because he's not doing it in public, but that's Daniel, who's told not to pray, and he simply prays. So even if you say boldness, that's a Christ-like trait. Well, what do you mean by that? It's more a commitment to doing the right thing than it is a brashness or an in-your-faceness.
Boldness itself is not a masculine trait. There's a specific type of boldness. And that's, again, there's a lot of ill-defined things going on. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation, because there's so many ill-defined things. I mean, in the church and just life in general, women are called to be bold. They're called to have a lot of boldness. Now, where are they to be bold? How are they to be bold? I want a woman that's going to, she's going to be bold in raising her children. She's going to stand up to the culture when the culture tells her she's wrong for pursuing biblical femininity. I want her to be bold in proclaiming the gospel. I want her to be bold in standing for Christ. I want her to, there's so many ways that she's called to be bold as well. What type of boldness? There is a masculine boldness, as you were bringing up, but we need to define these terms, because when we leave them loose like this, things become useless.
Yeah, I think if I could just throw a scripture out there that I think is really helpful in this regard, in Psalm 15:4, it speaks of the righteous person who will stand before God. It says, "In whose eyes a vile person is despised, but who honors those who fear the Lord." So you have this. They despise the wicked. They despise the things that are worldly and harmful, who honors the fear of the Lord. And then the last line says, who swears to his own hurt and does not change. And that's more actually, when you think of the godly men that it's the person who says their word is their bond. They will do it. You can absolutely depend upon them. They have a conviction in their heart that this is right. I've always liked, since I was a little boy, the Davy Crockett thing. Be sure you're right, and then go ahead. And that's actually is a masculine Christian man trait, to say, I know I'm right on this, and I have to do it, even though it's going to cost. And there's been times in my life it's going to cost. That's the kind of boldness, which oftentimes is not putting it in anybody's face. It's simply just quietly doing the right thing.
It's integrity.
Yeah,
it's integrity. You have to have that integrity that says, this is right, therefore I'm going to do it. It's not performative. It's not defiant. It's commitment. But I want to read a couple more of these tweets just to clarify that yes, this is kind of a big issue. To be clear, Tate is an absolute pagan, hellbound. No Christian man should run to him. Good statement. Complete contradiction here. But young Christian men are seeing righteous virtues in men like Tate, Rogan, Peterson, etc. Twice now he's thrown in other names. And he's saying that those traits are absent among pastors. Last one, because Tate, in his better stuff, represents the masculinity of Christ better than most pastors. It's sad, but true. Now, again, my issue here is how unhelpful these things are. Like I asked you earlier, how does this help a young man who's being swept up by the Tate cult? And I want to clarify how I'm using the word cult there. Cult of personality. I'm trying to bring people in and hold them to me as their main influence, not religious cult. But he develops a cult of personality around him, and he manipulates specifically young, impressionable, weak men. These men need someone masculine in their life, but it isn't Tate. Tate is giving them the deeds of the flesh. That's not masculine. But, okay, let's transition here. Now, there was something else we were going to talk about, but we've been talking long enough. We're going to scrap that. That'll come in a different conversation another day. But let's talk about biblical masculinity. because we've talked about how people haven't defined things. We shouldn't engage in the same thing. So, Dirk, what is well, I'll put this out there. I think the biggest thing that's been missing in the conversation on whatever side you're on is establishing the foundation of what masculinity is. Because, yeah, people can have aspects of masculinity, but if it's not grounded to any one foundation, it's useless. It's meaningless. It's a house built on sand. It's a fool's house. What is the foundation of masculinity, biblically speaking? Where does that begin?
Well, so I think one of the problems when somebody goes to start defining masculinity, I think they actually need to take a step back. And as a Christian, if you're thinking from a Christian perspective, and you need to start with just asking about humanity, because masculinity is one representation of humanity. But many people, if you ask them, well, describe what it is to be human, they're going to bake into that cake sinfulness, selfishness. People are selfish. People are all right. And so any sort of definition of humanity or of masculinity is going to say, well, of course, everybody's out to get their own. And of course, we're all sinners. But when we think from a biblical perspective, mankind was originally created moral and upright. The fact that we're all sinners now does not mean that sin is intrinsic to what it means to be human. And we know this, as an absolute Christian fact because the Son of God became a man. He took on a human nature. He took on everything it means to be human. He was like us in every way. Hebrews chapters 2 and 4 are really helpful on this. It says it explicitly that he even suffered temptation, not as a sinner, but having to suffer through, the world and the devil trying to trip him up. And he suffered through all those things for our sake, perfectly representing humanity and also perfectly sinful. And so Hebrews 2:17, he was made like his brothers in every respect. So we can say there is a perfect example of humanity, and specifically when we're talking as men, talking about men, a perfect example of masculinity, because of course he was a man. Although there are certainly examples in in Christ that women, wives and daughters and women in the church can look to as well. But so the first thing we have to say is if we're going to define Christian view or a biblical view of humanity or specifically masculinity, we have to say, well, it looks like Christ, because that's the most perfect representation of humanity that it has ever been. So it's not selfish, it's not prideful, it's not lazy, it's actually compassionate, it's kind, it's loving. And that's where we have to start. And so the basic picture of this is what humanity is actually supposed to look like. And then we know in Genesis, God gave us two distinct expressions of that humanity, male or female, right? The blending of those things, that's the error of the LGBT stuff, right? You're either a man or you're a woman. So you're one of two distinct and immutable expressions of humanity.
Yep.
And those are going to have some differences. But the reason I actually wanted to start there is because it's like a Venn diagram. If you say, what does it mean to be to have a biblical masculinity? If you look at it, it's like two circles that overlaps massively with what it means to have a biblical femininity. Because because they're both true expressions of humanity. And the reason that's important is because one of the objections that's being made by some people in the question of defining masculinity is people will they'll point to the Beatitudes, right, in the Sermon on the Mount, or they'll point to the love chapter, 1 Corinthians 13, or they'll point to the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. And they'll say, this is a great example of what it means to be a true man of God, a true masculine picture, right? And then the response will come from a lot of these guys who are into this sort of, we could say, hyper-masculinity movement. They'll say, but a woman could do all those things, therefore it cannot define true masculinity.
And
that's
to be
why I
clear,
said
that exact statement has been said multiple times. Dirk, you're
Yes.
quoting there. You're not just saying that theoretically.
Yeah. And that's why I say if you start with true humanity and say there are two distinct expressions of it, male and female. Expression, someone could quibble about that word, but my point is you're either in that you're either a man or a woman. There's massive overlap. Like you read the New Testament documents, there is a little bit that applies to men or oftentimes husbands, and then to wives. You could look at like Ephesians 5, but most of what he says applies to both to such an extent because they're both true expressions of humanity that he doesn't need to make any distinction. So you read through 6 chapters of Ephesians, there's a very small amount of it that is specifically applying to husbands and specifically applying to wives. And that's where I think the Venn diagram is the best picture here. That when I study what it's like to be a true man, and my wife studies what it's like to be a true woman, where I'm teaching that to my sons and my daughters, there are things that are unique and different, but we have to start with the fact that most of it is going to overlap. And that's a good thing, because they're both true expressions of humanity. And if you say you can't define masculinity by something that I could share with my wife in any way, then we really have no connection. Are we both truly in the image of God? So I don't want to say anyone's explicitly making that error, but I think maybe they're implicitly making that error.
Yeah, they're doing it. They're not knowingly saying this, but they're saying it in a way that they're not thinking about the consequences of what they're doing. Because, well, there are very few things that are masculine or feminine. What makes most things masculine or feminine is who is doing the thing. Who is the doer? The doer is where it becomes masculine or feminine. So again, the Venn diagram, there's all these things that overlap. Let's go to the fruit of the Spirit. And one of the reasons I want to bring up fruit of the Spirit in particular, not just because you brought it up, but because it's right after the deeds of the flesh. Here's what Tate does. Here are the deeds of the flesh, but then here's the fruit of the Spirit. Now, when it comes to love, joy, peace, patience, when it comes to these, those are for all of humanity, man and woman. So yes, a man could do it, a woman could do it, but here's the question. Does a woman's self-control express itself identically to a man's self-control? Or are they called, because of their different genders, their different roles in the church, in the family, in whatever area it is, does that get expressed differently? And yes, it does. Men and women, in the things that we share, we also express them differently. And that's something that needs to be understood. The question oftentimes is not, is this masculine or is this feminine? But the question is really, what is the feminine expression of this? And what is the masculine expression of this? In a specific thing, what is the man called to and what is the woman called to? But we're both called to love, joy, peace, patience, kindness. We're both called to these. And there's a distinction that's not being made by people that concerns me. And here's my concern, is it confuses men by seeming like it's downplaying those as womanly things, but it also, and I want to hear your thoughts on this, it demeans femininity. It presents femininity as a negative thing to be avoided. And when femininity is being so heavily attacked, it seems like we as men need to rescue that, not act like, oh, we need to emphasize our manliness so much that we push out anything that is feminine. We treat it like it's bad.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, feminism, and anytime you add an ism, you're talking about an ideology, right? So a worldly ideology has in many ways infected large amounts of the church. I mean, there was one of the tweets you read that said Tate's a better example of masculinity than most pastors. And I didn't want to, we don't have to go back to that, but it is an interesting question to ask, like, how are you kind of getting this statistic? Because that's a pretty bold statement to make. But that there is such a thing as, like, and again, one of the other tweets, it's like, well, the Christ-like attitudes are boldness, and we talked about that earlier. But then it becomes, to be a man is to be bold, to all these sort of things. It's these sort of gruff, outward kind of things. But it's actually interesting, I mentioned Ephesians earlier, like the command to husbands, and it's interesting, most of the male-woman commands are in the context of marriage. And so, then you by extension apply them to other relationships. But Ephesians 5:25, husbands, love your wives. So it's actually interesting. It's actually interesting that the thing that he specifically has to say to Christian men, and you get this in other passages like 1 Peter 3, is be compassionate, be kind, be gentle, be caring, be all these sort of things. And so you say, well, if you're going to define what it means to be a man, those are just as important. And you go, wow, those are women's characteristics. Well, no, that we share them. I share them with my wife, but a child needs a mom and a dad. And that's true. We can say that. It's very easy to say that, again, with like gay marriage or something, but it's also true and unfortunate for situations where in divorce or, where a spouse dies. I mean, I had a brother-in-law that passed away very suddenly, and my niece suffered greatly because she didn't have a dad. Now, praise the Lord, my sister-in-law got remarried, and he actually adopted her, and that's her dad. And it's amazing and it's wonderful. But watching that, you say, my sister-in-law is such a loving mom. She can't be a dad. She could not do that role. She did it to the best of her ability, but she can't fulfill that role because she's just naturally, it's not who she is.
Yeah.
And I think there is, you think, well, what's the difference then? I think somebody might be frustrated and say, well, what's the difference? You haven't really defined it. I think like one good example, 1 Peter 3:7, husbands, love your wives in an understanding way, showing honor to the woman as a weaker vessel. And so you do have this. We naturally know men go off to war. Men, we're tough and we do tough things, and women are naturally gravitate to homemaking and nurturing and all these sort of things. And the picture that Peter gives is of like two vessels. You've got a cast iron pan and then you've got a fine china teacup. And it's actually the man's role to protect his wife, to guard his family, to provide for them, to you might say be more outward facing, and the wife is more inward facing in the home and whatnot, and taking care of that. And again, sometimes people can get really legalistic of, well, who takes out the trash or whatever. Like, who does the dishes? Is it masculine to do the dishes? Well, it's masculine to love your wife, dude. And so if she's overwhelmed, we homeschool. My wife oftentimes has a lot of correcting and stuff to do. I mean, again, we have 7 kids. How can I show her honor? How can I love her? How can I build her up in front of my children? That's the more masculine thing to do. And that's the actual more biblical 1 Peter application than what looks cool to my buddies. Exactly.
Yeah, you're caring for your household. And what does it say in Timothy, right? Where it says, if you don't take care of your own household, you're worse than an unbeliever.
Yeah.
That's some intense things.
Yeah. And that would apply first and foremost to men, women by extension, but first and foremost to men. I wouldn't want to give any impression that we're like, well, some sort of egalitarian, men and women, they're totally interchangeable. No, we're not saying that at all. But we're saying there's so much overlap. There's so much overlap between that you can't ever look at the fruit of the Spirit and say, well, that doesn't define masculinity. Well, it certainly does, because the perfect man, Christ, had all of those things.
Yep. And nothing in that chapter, nothing in Galatians 5 says, oh, here for women. No, it says for you, all of you.
Yeah. Yeah.
In fact, I was very close to just reading the entire chapter 5 of Galatians, because if you want to see a lot of manliness, read Galatians 5. Paul's responding to a whole bunch of different things, and there's a reason the fruit of the Spirit comes up. But, verse 13, for you were called to freedom, brethren, only do not turn your freedom into an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another. That's a command to the whole church. That is so far from, the hyper manly man things. Are we to be manly men? Yes. but in what context and in what way? And again, I see that missing from the conversation.
It's funny you brought that up because I actually tweeted out the other day. I said, serving others is not feminine or effeminate. I think I might have said effeminate, but that's the thing it's interesting. I think that you can say, well, this person, again, what launched this whole conversation. I think it's a good conversation in general, but what launched it is, hey, here you have a person who is, who is a manly man, a man's man, all this sort of stuff. And you think, well, he's actually only out, everything he does only selfishly, only for himself. And if you're going to say that somehow those are proper men's traits, then what are you saying? Well, he has big muscles. I mean, like, that's really all you're saying, he's good at talking
so much that what are you even talking about anymore? You've reduced it beyond, you have the category, you have a specific expression, and then you've reduced it even further than that. You've lowered the bar to the point where someone can get, 10% on the test, and you say A+. How that's not helpful.
Yeah, and I think, again, I would point to that we should, as Christians, ultimately point back to the example of Christ. Philippians 2. Here's this great the one section there, 5 through 11, is this hymn to Christ, who didn't consider equality with God something to be grasped, but humbled himself, taking on the form of a servant. But the funny thing is, here's this great one of the greatest Christological statements in the New Testament. It's actually just an example, and a lot of scholars think it was an early hymn that they sang in the early church that Paul's quoting, which would be cool. We don't know if that's true, but what's interesting is Paul's just using it as an example of, that attitude that Jesus had, that's the attitude that you should have. So husbands, fathers, that attitude that Jesus had who, yeah, but I'm much more important than you. That's not the attitude of Christ. He says immediately before that, he says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So if that's the perfect picture of humanity and the perfect man, Christ, models that, then that's going to look different. You read the faith chapter in Hebrews 11, and then the great thing about that is they all had the same faith in the same God, and it applied itself in totally different ways. Like, only one guy in the history of the world has ever been asked to build a really, really big boat for the saving of the world, right? Only one guy was asked to take his son up on the mountain and sacrifice him, and then God provides the sacrifice. So there's uniqueness to all of those situations. So sometimes people say, well, I need you to spell out chapter and verse every single thing how my life's going to live. The Bible doesn't actually do that. It gives us principles.
Yep.
And so then and that's the hard part. And that's also why I'd say you need to be part of a good church where you can go to your elders who are men that have lived some of this stuff and say, here's what I'm dealing with. Help me navigate this thing. Because what we're getting here is we're getting principles for, you want to model masculinity in your home? Care about every single person in that home more than yourself. Treat your wife like a fine china vessel and treat yourself like a cast iron skillet.
A funny little
thing? You can get
thing?
banged around, she can't.
Yeah. And that's an important thing. But a funny little thing? People talk about alpha. You got to have this alpha personality, whatever it is. And, they link that, it's an alpha wolf. You got an alpha wolf personality. And the alpha wolf, which is a term that wolf researchers have started to move away from because of that sort of usage outside of wolves. But the average wolf pack is a family unit. You have the alpha wolf, which is just the father. You have the breeding females, sometimes only one, and then you have the kits. And then when they grow up enough, they leave. It's a single family unit outside of rare exceptions where one pack will conquer another. But here's the thing. The alpha wolf will sometimes, very often, be the last wolf to eat. Make sure that the pups get all the food first. Sometimes the alpha wolf will be the last in the pack when moving because he's trying to protect the rear, and he lets the primary female lead. Is it because she's now in charge? No, it's because he needs to be in their rear to protect them, see danger. And I just find it funny how, now you can find all sorts of other things in nature, but I just find it funny that the one example that's used to be like, oh, this is masculinity, alpha personality, you got to take charge. The opposite is true. The opposite, this self-sacrificing happens.
That's a great picture of if you want to say, hey, where can I look in nature and see this sort of thing? What's it supposed to look like? Yeah, it's supposed to look like sacrificing yourself. Again, the example that we're given as husbands in leading our family is not as a tyrant, but as self-sacrificial love, like that Christ did for his church. And I love one of the, outside of the Bible, one of my favorite definitions of sin, because it's so helpful to me, is Augustine says that sin makes us turn inwards on ourselves. You can think almost like a black hole, and it just keeps just collapsing in on itself. And we're supposed to look upward to God. We're supposed to focus upward to God. We're supposed to focus outward on other people. And instead, we've just become this black hole of selfishness. And I think like that's really what we're saying. If you say like, well, here's a tough guy, here's a man's man. I don't really know if he really is, but some guy like Tate, what we're really saying is anything you could see there and say there's a traits of a man are so corrupted, so turned inward on themselves as to be of no value. I mean, you could even think about cultural icons from past generations. I grew up on, Westerns and war movies and stuff. You often had these characters that weren't great characters, but I can't think of a single John Wayne that at the end of the day, he didn't lay down his life to save the innocent. He didn't care about other people. And so what was funny is even in those stories where you have oftentimes a fairly questionable character and definitely not the best or whatever early on in the movie, they still are exemplifying positive traits. So it's not to say like, can you ever see in culture a positive traits? Can you look in nature? Like you mentioned the wolf pack. Absolutely, we can see those things. We want to look ultimately to the Bible and help us to guide us and make sure that we're not getting wrong expressions.
Yep.
But if you have somebody who's so corrupted, so twisted around, then at what point none of the things you can list are actually, as the one tweet said, Christ-like traits, and you say, well, not actually, it's exactly the opposite. Actually, the expressions are all anti-Christ. And in fact, he became a Muslim simply because he was looking for the most masculine expression of religion and found it in Islam, according to him anyway. Because Jesus is a weak guy. And so, like it actually, his religion, he is sort of, you mentioned cult earlier, he's kind of selling a religion because in a way, it's not really probably Islam as a lot of Islamic people would think of it. It's really just, I want a religious expression of masculinity.
Yeah.
And at that point you say, well, then it is a false religion. He is actually selling a false religion.
Yeah. And that's what's just bizarre to me because false religions, I mean, you want to talk about like worst categories, false religion is always going to top them. Anything that says, here is a God other than the Lord your God is worse than anything underneath it. Because what happens? How do you get to drag time story hour? You get that by replacing God with a false God. And then he hands you over to your sin. That's how we got there. So the solution isn't to go, oh yeah, here's this guy. He's got some things wrong, but there's redeemable qualities. No, he's selling you something that is contrary to God. I mean, Proverbs 19:1, better is a poor man who walks in his integrity than he who's perverse in his speech and is a fool. 29:1, a man who hardens his neck after much reproof will suddenly be broken beyond remedy. Famous verse that we don't quote the end of. Proverbs 1:7. What? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. The contrast here between the wise man and Tate, the fool, is radical. And they're not said, hey, there's still some good you can find there. No, the Bible puts him into the category of fool who does not fear the Lord, fool who is not a wise man.
Yeah, and I actually think that the Proverbs need to be applied more in discussions like this and just in general in the church, because again, all of those are not that they're exclusively masculine, but it is funny that almost all of them are a wise man, a foolish man, whatever. So the upright man, the proper man, the masculine picture, if you will, is of the person who is spurning evil and wants to follow the right path, and actually, will suffer loss for it. He won't work for a company that's cheating people, even though it makes him a lot more money. He won't rip people off. He won't, you go through life, and sometimes there can be times where I had to work for, I worked for a contractor for a while who was dishonest, and he ripped everybody off. And it was a horrible experience to have to go through. And I got out of there as fast as I could because, in the construction industry, it's very easy to do that in certain circumstances and then just be like, well, you're not going to sue me for this. And so you can make a lot of extra profit.
And that's so bad over in that area in particular. Because I worked in construction over there too, on the design side. And wow,
and so you're in the middle of that and you go like, well, I could prosper. And you go, but I can't prosper off of this. Like, I need to flee this as fast as I can, and so that's the thing too. In a biblical picture for believers, winning is not making the most money. Winning is not being the most well thought of.
So, brief interruption, but we're back. Dirk, just a 2-minute little thing. What would your advice be to young men in the church who are looking to Tate, and just kind of the church in general when it comes to masculinity?
Yeah, I would just say like it feeds your ego and you like it and you want to be a tough guy and everything. And it will never grow you as a man. It's sort of like eating food poisoning in your food and expecting to grow healthy. It's just never going to work. And so like the thing is that read the Old Testament. Read through the historical sections of the Bible and look at all of these examples of men of God who in various ways and at various times and in their unique situations were men of God and were tough and faced adversity, and some were with the sword and many weren't. And then look to people in your own Christian community and be part of a Christian community where there are men you can look up to. And maybe just say, I want to get to know you better. I want to learn from you. Some things are taught and some things are caught. And I think there's a certain amount of with men looking up to other men, a lot of it's honestly just caught. You look and you say, that guy, I want to be like that guy. He's dependable. Yeah. He loves his church. He loves his wife. He loves his kids. And someday I want to be as cool as he is. And honestly, there's this whole toxic sort of hero worship that can go on in celebrity preachers and all the rest. But there's actually the fact of the matter is we need some people to look up to in our lives. And that's a good thing.
And that's where celebrity stuff comes in, is we're vulnerable to that, to turning people into celebrities, because we're looking for role models. We're looking for people to look up to. And in modern society, that can easily get replaced from an in-person, physical, immediate connection to someone on a screen far away who fundamentally does not care about you because they don't know you exist.
I think the solution to that, like you just said, is localism. Part of your local community, part of your family, or part of your church, especially part of your local church, be plugged into a local church where you can have those sort of things. It stops it from being celebrity because you actually get to know these people. Yeah. It's totally different than the guy you just watch online or whatever.
Well, and those are going to be people that are going to walk with you. And I've said this multiple times on the podcast before, and I'll say it again, and I'll just hammer it down. You don't need me either. If at any point you are listening to a sermon or something from your pastor and you go, oh, well, Kyle said something about this. I kind of like what he said better. Okay, never turn on the podcast again. Never do it again. You've turned it into something that it shouldn't. Not that you should just blindly go, oh, my pastor says the best things. But if you're starting to compare what you have in your local church with something else, that's discontentment. That's discontentment with the thing that should be your home, your family. Those are the people that you actually are sharing your life with. Yeah, me and you, we're saved. We're family. But we're not going to get to actually celebrate like that until we see each other face to face in heaven, in eternity. So, no, it's got to be that local thing. But anyway, I think this has been a really good conversation. I hope it's been really helpful. I really appreciate you coming on, Dirk. I really appreciate a lot of things you had to say. I really think it helped balance out the conversation. I think I would have got really ranty if it was just me. But pleasure to have you on. Is there anything else you'd like to say as we wrap up?
No, just I appreciate coming on. It was a great discussion. It's always, in my heart, and I know it's your heart as well, is just always want to turn it back to the Bible and say, hey, it's not enough to just rant and say this guy's wrong or something. It's also to say here's why and here's a better way, and try to be helpful. And so hopefully it was helpful. It was a great conversation. I love talking about the scriptures, and we want to be better husbands and fathers and churchmen as well.
Yeah, and there's always room to grow. There will never not be room to grow.
Yeah.
So, thank you for coming on. I hope it's been a useful episode. Well, I think that was it. That episode is going to set some sort of tone for this season of the podcast. I don't know if that's going to be a good tone or a bad tone. I can't gauge where anything is in online discourse nowadays, and I am stuck because of trying to pay attention to things. I'm often stuck in much more niche areas than the average Christian is. So I hope that set a good tone for this season of the podcast. I found that to be a wonderful, wonderful episode. There are several things that me and Dirk wanted to talk about, but we just did not have time for. I will likely bring him back on. One thing I want to bring up, we're going to be doing live streams occasionally from now on. If you have any questions about the podcast, about this episode, what we covered, give me those questions. Give me those questions now so I can have them ready to go for the live stream. Live streams are going to focus a little bit on Q&A, and it's going to give me a chance to follow up on things that might not have been clear, or maybe you had a question about. I want to get that. I want to hit that. So leave any questions you have. Like I said, there's a little bit of a change in the podcast. You can I'm renumbering it. So this is season 4 of the podcast, but I'm starting back over at episode 1. Partially because giving that refresh is useful to me for kind of framing things. And like I said, it's still associated with Enemies Within the Church, but it really is my podcast now. Towards the end of last year, Enemies Within the Church no longer has the funds to fund the podcast. All the other funds have been going to some other projects, and income has dwindled down at the same time. So costs going up, income going down, can't afford some of the other things, including the podcast and some of the other work I was doing. So it's now really just my thing. And I wanted to, if I was ever going to make any changes, that was the time. But don't expect any sort of big changes going forward. It is what it is now. It's something that I'm comfortable with, and I'm really excited for the future. Now, again, you can, if you want to support the work, you can go to the Patreon or the Give, Send, Go. Those are both linked in the description. I would really appreciate that. It helps give me a certain type of feedback that helps me gauge, hey, is this useful to someone? I want that verbal feedback. But if you do feel that, led to support the podcast in a financial way, that would really mean a lot, but I'm not by any means demanding that, requiring that. There are so many other things, more important things, that could use your money before you even consider giving to me. With that said, what kind of things can you expect from the podcast going forward? Like I said, I'm going to be doing live streams occasionally, trying to answer questions. I'm going to be doing, again, more teaching, but we're still going to be looking at errors. Now, sometimes it might be more focused on the positive, on the teaching. Sometimes it might be centralized on an error. Hey, here's this error, but we're going to think through it. And that's really kind of going to be the theme of this year is I want to help you think through things. I really want to help you think through things. I want to take you into my thought processes as I look at something and help you to understand, okay, what is Kyle seeing and why is he pulling out the things that he is? Hopefully in that, I can be something that builds you up. I feel like me and Sam, we were kind of hitting a stride towards the end that was really good, that was really positive. Then when it went back to just me. Now, if you don't know, Sam, a lot of life changes, including taking on a lead pastor role at a church. So he really needs to put his focus where it's most important. That's awesome. That's a good thing. So we're happy for Sam. But unfortunately, that left me in a place where I had to figure out, okay, now how do I successfully do this without that person to bounce off of? So that's one of the reasons I'm making changes, because I need to find the setup, the way that works best for me to be edifying, because that's the goal here, to build you up in truth. I would love your thoughts and feedback on that, of how is that going? Thoughts and just observations. Let me know. But yeah, this is going to be the podcast going forward. I hope this has been a good introduction to it. I'm going to have to develop some new routines and habits, which is always fun, but it's a positive opportunity. It's a positive opportunity. So thank you for joining me on the first episode of the TLDR Christianity podcast. And if you don't know what that name means, TLDR stands for too long didn't read. It's a phrase used online that for two different things: either, hey, what you just posted was way too long, I'm not going to read that, or, hey, here's a summary for those people that are going to say this is too long. Here's my summary. And that's kind of the little tongue in cheek on it is, my goal is to give you that summary, help break things down. It doesn't mean it's always going to be short, but help break things down in a way that you can understand it. But also a little tongue in cheek of, the people that go, Christianity, it's too complex. Christianity, Bible, too long, didn't read it. Kind of playing with things there. But I hope this has been enjoyable. Look forward to your feedback. I look forward to this season of the podcast. God is good, so go bring glory to his name. Well, I guess I have an outro now. That's the same thing that happened with Don't Go Woke, is I just kind of didn't know what to say, and I said something, and then it became the outro. There you go.